black boy, often lost in thought during class, was suddenly called out by his teacher. He was forced to stand and face a math equation far beyond his grade level. His classmates, some laughing, others doubtful, watched him with skepticism. What they didn't know was that the boy standing at the board was a hidden math prodigy. The midday sun cast warm streaks of light across the linoleum floors of Westfield Middle School. It was early autumn in Chicago, and the classrooms hummed with the low murmur of students chatting and chairs scraping against the floor. Room 214 was no exception. The buzz of adolescent energy filled the space as students filed in for their 8th grade math class. At the back of the room, near the window, Malcolm Hayes settled into his usual seat. The 13-year-old had a quiet presence that allowed him to fade into the background. His brown eyes, sharp but often distant, wandered toward the world outside as he placed his notebook on the desk. His posture was relaxed, almost too much so, with one arm resting on the desk and the other propping up his chin. The scene beyond the window, trees swaying gently in the breeze, a bird hopping along the fence, seemed to capture his attention far more than the bustling classroom around him. Malcolm wasn't inattentive by choice. He had a sharp mind, one that often worked faster than the pace of classroom lessons. Numbers and equations fascinated him, but the repetitive drills and slow progress of his math class felt uninspiring. Instead of raising his hand or engaging, he let his mind drift, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the world outside. His notebook, though mostly blank on the assigned pages, hid margins filled with advanced equations and solutions he'd scribbled during his free time, puzzles he had challenged himself to solve. At the front of the room, Mr. Robert Langston stood with his arms crossed, surveying the class as they took their seats. A no-nonsense teacher with years of experience, Mr. Langston was known for his sharp tongue and high expectations. His crisp button-down shirt and neatly pressed slacks only added to his aura of authority. He prided himself on being able to spot potential in his students and wasn't afraid to push them when he thought they weren't meeting their capabilities. Today, however, his patience was wearing thin. The results of the most recent math test lay in a neat stack on his desk, and while a few students had performed well, the majority had struggled. Mr. Langston didn't tolerate mediocrity, and the sight of so many low scores left him questioning whether his students were putting in the effort he demanded. He picked up the stack of papers and began calling names, handing back the tests with brief comments. "Decent work," he said to some, and "you need to study more" to others. When he reached Malcolm's desk, he hesitated for a moment. His test sat at the top of the stack, marked with a large red 100% circled at the top. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had aced a test, but his apparent lack of interest in class frustrated him. Handing him the paper, he made no comment, his lips pressing into a thin line as he walked back to the front of the room. "All right, listen up." Mr. Langston's voice cut through the chatter, silencing the room. He placed the stack of tests on his desk and leaned against it, his sharp gaze scanning the rows of students. "Most of you did okay," he began, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but a lot of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Malcolm, barely listening, rested his chin on his hand as his eyes drifted back to the window. The soft rustle of leaves outside seemed far more engaging than Mr. Langston's critique. He didn't notice the teacher's sharp eyes flicker in his direction as he continued. "This is basic algebra," Mr. Langston said, his voice rising slightly. "You'll need to understand this if you want to succeed in high school, college, or anywhere else in life." He paused, his gaze lingering on Malcolm's distant expression. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Malcolm Hayes," he snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. Malcolm jolted upright, his hand slipping from his chin as his classmates turned to look at him. His heart raced, and heat rushed to his cheeks. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Mr. Langston narrowed his eyes. "You seem very interested in what's going on outside," he said, nodding toward the window. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but quickly shut it again, unsure of what to say. The room filled with a few muffled chuckles, but Mr. Langston wasn't smiling. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," he continued, his tone sharp. "Come up here." The room went silent as Malcolm stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His classmates watched with a mix of amusement and curiosity, some whispering under their breath. "He's gonna freeze," one student muttered. "Bet he doesn't even know what's going on," another said, stifling a laugh. Malcolm swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he walked to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes, every step making the distance to the whiteboard feel impossibly long. Mr. Langston stood by the board, marker in hand, his expression unreadable. "Let's see how much you've been paying attention," he said, writing an equation on the board. It was complex, far beyond what the class had covered, but not impossible for someone with Malcolm's talent. He stepped back, holding the marker out to him. "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost challenging. "Show us what you've got." Malcolm took the marker, the cool plastic pressing into his hand. He stared at the equation for a moment, his mind racing. The whispers and quiet laughter behind him only made the pressure worse. His heart pounded, and for a fleeting moment he considered handing the marker back and walking away. But something stopped him. A small voice inside reminded him of the countless hours he had spent solving problems just like this one. This wasn't about Mr. Langston or his classmates. It was about him and what he knew he could do. Malcolm took a deep breath, raised the marker to the board, and began to write. The classroom seemed to shrink as Malcolm stood in front of the whiteboard, the marker feeling heavier in his hand with each passing second. His eyes darted over the equation, a tangled maze of variables, exponents, and fractions. It wasn't the kind of problem most 8th graders would encounter, and it was clear Mr. Langston had chosen it to test him. Behind him, the class whispered and snickered, their hushed voices barely audible but sharp enough to cut through the silence. But as Malcolm's hand moved, the laughter faded. At first, his strokes were tentative, testing the waters. But as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier. The class watched in stunned silence as he worked methodically, isolating variables, simplifying fractions, and eliminating unnecessary steps. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was dismantling it, breaking it down into its core components. His breath was shallow, his focus razor-sharp. The room no longer existed. There was only the equation, only the numbers and letters forming a language he understood better than spoken words. His fingers tightened around the marker, the ink gliding across the board as he neared the final step. When Malcolm wrote the final answer and capped the marker, the room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. He turned, his stomach twisting in anticipation. Mr. Langston stepped forward, his eyes scanning each line of Malcolm's work. The silence stretched, unbearable and endless. Then, after a pause, Mr. Langston spoke. "This is correct." A ripple of disbelief spread through the class, followed by scattered applause that grew louder as more students joined in. Malcolm, his cheeks burning, stood frozen, unsure how to react. But as he looked around the room, he saw something new in their eyes. Not skepticism, not ridicule, but respect. Then, from the back of the room, someone started clapping slowly. The sound was deliberate, almost mocking, but it didn't stop. It grew, gaining momentum, spreading through the room like wildfire. Hands that once pointed at him in ridicule were now coming together in applause. It wasn't just polite, it was genuine. Malcolm could feel it. The shift in the way they saw him, the way they saw what he was capable of. Mr. Langston nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Was it approval? Pride? Malcolm wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. He had done it. For the first time, Malcolm Hayes wasn't afraid to be seen. He met the eyes of his classmates, of the students who had doubted him, laughed at him, dismissed him, and he didn't look away. He stood taller, his heart still pounding, but now for a different reason. He had proven them wrong, and as he walked back to his seat, the claps still echoing in his ears, he knew this was just the beginning.